Let's talk a bunch of different topics.
How her career get there.
This is a podcast with Lauren Asghari.
This is the Lauren Asghari podcast, How'd Her Career Get There? And my guest today is Carolyn Walton Lynch, who is the founder of Mixolo.
Hello, Lauren.
Welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So let's jump right into it. Let's talk about, we'll come back to Mixolo because we have a great story there. But let's talk about you as a little kid. Where'd you grow up? Siblings?
Well, I came from a big bunch. I was born in Germany. My father was a career military person. And so we moved around a bit, but as a result, I lived in several places and ended up in Maryland at age 18. And that's where I sort of started my life and career as an adult. I went to University of Maryland, College Park. And luckily, my family, even though we were military, we're all pretty much in the same area in the Northeast and have created our own little dynasty here. So we're very connected. And yeah, it's been a great experience to have, that background.
Mm-hmm.
It makes me flexible, to just go anywhere.
And what were you like as a little girl? What were some of your personality traits?
Well, being number 6, the last, let's say I might be an attention seeker. Yeah. So, I had to sort of make sure my voice was heard. And as a result, I found myself being like this person that was always defending like the little person, so to speak, or someone who didn't have a voice. So we had to be very creative because we moved a lot. And so we didn't have a lot of, sometimes our toys didn't make it or games. So we made up some interesting games. And one of my favorites was like court. So, and typically I was the one defending someone, over some, weird thing like who stole the potato chips, it was just crazy. But we had a lot of fun with that. And serendipitously, I ended up having this class in, I think it was 7th grade in law. And I just fell in love with it. I just thought this is the way that justice could be, disseminated.
Mm-hmm.
And we can keep things fair on this earth. And so I had this in mind, throughout my sort of secondary, primary school, career, and call it a career. And, but interestingly enough, when it was time for me to go to college, we had some issues. My father felt he was very ill. And I ended up sort of having to make a decision about what I was going to major in, to sort of try to get through in 4 years because I was somewhat limited. And I ended up majoring in accounting. And it turned out to be a great choice for me. It doesn't offer me as much flexibility in terms of being creative,
Mm-hmm.
but it was the great thing that I can fall back on now
Mm-hmm.
in my career. And it turned out that I did nothing but accounting, things beyond accounting, way beyond accounting in my career, because I had in mind that there were certain things that I wanted, there was a mark that I wanted to leave on the world,
Sure.
in terms of just being an advocate for people, honestly, who,
Mm-hmm.
in some ways people perceive me as having confidence and somewhat fearless. It's just not completely true. I'm human, but on the other hand, I don't operate with limits in mind.
Mm-hmm.
I just sort of, if there's an opportunity and I'm able-bodied, I'm going to pursue that opportunity. And I think that's what kind of fed my entrepreneurial spirit as well.
Nature or nurture the fearlessness?
Well, I guess certainly my parents, they also were confident enough to enter into spaces where maybe people didn't feel they belonged. Yeah. So, and being of a certain age, I lived through certain periods in American history that were difficult for people of color
Mm-hmm.
and also for women. So as my parents were, I found myself being a pioneer in certain instances, being the first, so to speak, and also being one of the first women in to navigate corporate America,
Mm-hmm.
in those days in the late 80s, early 80s.
Sure.
So, no, just watching them and my mother being an advocate for us as children, because often we would enter into school systems that were not yet integrated and have issues with that where she would overcome. And as a result, she was able to, make sure that we had certain opportunities and weren't closed. And again, so I believe it's, definitely my parents setting an example and not informing us that there were limits, because that happens sometimes in communities, whether it's a mother informing her daughter to take a certain path or, I don't know, a mother telling their child, don't be this way with the police, whatever the situation is. My parents really just didn't inform us that there were limits. And sometimes that was shocking because I would go out into the world and people would have a preconceived notion about what my capabilities were or my background. And so that was interesting. But on the other hand, I dealt with it. And when I could, I brought others along, whether it was women that I was nurturing in my circle or minorities who were having issues with access. So it's been a blessing in a way because I've been able to be helpful and not necessarily a distraction, so to speak.
How do you handle, whether it's now or throughout your career, throughout your life, the situations where people did have preconceived notions? And what advice would you give to other people, whatever their circumstances are, where maybe they're in a similar situation?
Well, I have this thing where find common ground. That's the first place you go. We all want the same things for ourselves, for our loved ones. And sometimes when we feel threatened by an outsider, we may tend to close that outsider off. But if you can find that common ground where, I don't know, your child is looking at colleges, something as simple as that, or you had a grandmother who, went through something really difficult, whether it's through the Holocaust or, some other, difficult situation, we can all relate because sometimes people, they'll look at a certain marginalized community and say they're being victims. But it turns out that all of us have had certain experiences that have shaped us. And there's similar experiences, maybe for different reasons. So I always seek common ground, sometimes humor. I remember sitting in a boardroom once and I made it to the boardroom, right? And I was the only woman in the room, only minority in the room. And I was asked, as an African-American, how certain employees in the company felt like all of the minorities. And I thought, well, I don't know. I didn't get a chance to call everyone this morning, right? I don't know. And the idea is, I think if you look at them first as humans with specific needs as well, then you can address whatever problem exists. And at that time, it was, again, corporate America was still shaping and including minorities and women. And it turned out that many of the minorities were at the bottom, but actually had higher educational qualifications. But certain people of other influences were getting supervisory positions. So, but it turned out that we were able to implement a program to help people with their personal development and a path for them to get to certain positions so that it wasn't, people weren't viewing it as, you're just cheating me. Well, how do we help you get those skills that you need to keep moving forward in the company? And of course, someone to track them, some sort of mentor. So I think there's always a solution if we can just find that commonality and also what's the outcome we want. We want happy employees. We want people to do the work. We want them to be productive and we want to grow this company. So so that's kind of how I approach it really. And again, that's been I got that from my parents and I've just used it in most of my dealings with people.
I love that. It's like the approach of, in life, it's like we're all human. Like, let's start there first and foremost. And you said it, we're all human. Let's start there. And then everybody has commonalities that we can find if we just try a little bit.
Yes.
So take me then to college. So you study accounting in college. And then
under duress,
you got to get out of there in 4 years.
Yeah, because I got to get this done. But I have to tell you, it wasn't a straight shot because I started with pre-law.
Okay.
But then I knew I had to switch it up. and get it done and get to work. So it
Do you
took me a
remember-
little while.
Do you remember being sorry to interrupt you? Do you remember being disappointed by that? Like,
Yes, everything changed in terms of the direction I was going. So I had to, I had to think on my feet. And again, like I said, I'm sort of adaptable, and I knew that I needed a college degree in order to, just be influential or make a mark. So I sorted through it, but it was really tough. Not only did my father get sick, my mother also ended up having open heart surgery. So it was just a sort of a drain on the family finances and attention and everything. It was just a bad timing. So Maryland wasn't my first choice. I really wanted to go to an all-women's college. And it was also an HBCU, historically black university, because I actually felt that I missed, in a way, like the full Black experience.
okay.
You know what I mean? Like I missed some things that I might have, that might have benefited me in terms of not always being in a position where I had to fight for what I needed, but actually where I was accepted, and I thought that would be a cool experience. And, but that didn't work out. So I ended up in the big world, because University of Maryland is like a microcosm of the world. And it was really, it was just, I had to think on my feet, and it turned out to be a great experience, except I did end up working full time, but I met so many different people from all over the world, and it was just an amazing experience. It was the experience that was a continuation of my life and helped me grow in terms of being that person in the room that could, relate to most people and advocate for them. So yeah, it was just a matter of looking at what are my options? How can I sustain myself and have a career that I could, really count on? And so I first business and then accounting, and then it turned out to be the thing that worked for me. But I went from there. My first job was in law. I went to a law firm to see if somehow I could still get my foot in there and figure out if this is the career that I wanted. But was there, I ended up in a law firm that was a corporate law, which was not always the most, there was no altruistic
Was your vision of
value.
Was your vision of being a lawyer to be the person that represents or fight for those that can't fight for themselves?
Absolutely. I mean, I even followed class action suits. I was kind of a nerd, where groups of people were, discriminated against, whether it was I had spent some time in West Virginia and followed some of the challenges with Black lung and just some of the ways that people were treated and all of those things resonated with me. But looking at that side, at that point, I felt, again, I needed to sort of build some wealth and begin my career. So after becoming a little disillusioned with law, I went to corporate America. At that point, it was difficult to move into some of the large CPA firms because they hire right out of college. So I ended up at Ross Perot's company, Electronic Data System. Yes. I don't know if people know he was an independent that ran for president. And a little bit wacky, but a brilliant businessman.
Texan, right?
Yes, he was from Texas, Waco. So that was really that experience at the law firm just sort of instructed me to get started on this accounting career, see what you can do with this. And I ended up in corporate America, and EDS was my first stop. And then I went on to Bell Atlantic, now Verizon. And I ended up in operations. I started as an internal auditor, and
Nobody likes
no.
Nobody likes auditors.
Oh my God. I was like, no one calls me. No one really wants to go out to lunch with me. I guess it would be, you could compare it to the police force having what is that called? The internal investigators. Yeah. You don't necessarily want them coming to visit you or calling you. So while I'm sitting there, I make the most of situations. I started mapping out the work processes, just to see if there were weaknesses. They hired me for something. And I think at the time they were having trouble with errors. and some of their advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So I went about just documenting all the work processes, the entire company, and pulling on my experience from EDS, where I was working as a financial analyst on deals. And EDS was a software company. You know, they did systems integration at the time, moving people from legacy systems now to the web. It was, you know, the web was becoming new.
Mm-hmm. Now, how old are you? Not to interrupt you, but how old were you at this point-ish?
I was in my late 20s, I guess around 27, 28 when I ended up at Verizon. And so I'm figuring this thing out. And once I produced this workflow, they were fascinated, you know, the executives. And at that point, I began to help them with their operational issues, which gave me a really broad view of how business works. So while I was an accountant, I also had this operational background that I was building. And so that was very interesting. It made me, again, more just, I was able to adapt to all kinds of situations and not just have the tunnel view that an accountant would of the outcome.
Mm-hmm.
I could actually influence the outcome with certain changes in the way people did work.
Well, and really understanding the operations, the business side, not just the numbers side of it.
Absolutely.
And then your decisions that you're making when you have a more holistic view, we're going to be ultimately more
just
well-informed.
Better informed. So now somewhere in there, I ended up getting married. And that was actually one of the reasons why I left EDS. They were moving, and I began to adjust for this new relationship that I was in, you know, this long-term relationship. And so that's how I landed at Verizon. Yeah.
And then so take us from how long were you ish at Verizon, and then where did you go from there?
Well, I was there for a few years, and then I became pregnant, which I'm sure that this podcast is for all, but a lot of women can relate to the adjustments that you have to make for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
And here I'm in the late 80s, you know, in this situation. It wasn't as easy to navigate.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, my bosses were like, so what are you going to do? And I said, I'm going to have a baby. So at the time I was really traveling a lot and just, you know, really engrossed and definitely interested in growing my career. It was just that the opportunities were, didn't necessarily mesh with the adjustments that I had to make at the time. And I wasn't able to, you know, there was no time off per se.
Mm-hmm.
And so I made a decision then that I really want more control over my lifestyle, my commitments. And I decided not to return once I had my child.
Mm-hmm.
I took some time off, and then, you know, I was getting calls 2 weeks in, you know, to when are you coming back? It was just crazy, which I thought was, you know, I want to come back, but I want to come back under different circumstances. And I was unable to negotiate a gradual. And to their defense, they were reliant on me, you know, so, but I did end up consulting back to them, to Verizon for a while. And it turned out that consulting practice started to grow. And I took on other clients. And at the time, my ex-husband, who was a systems engineer, I should say ex-husband, will tell you how that happened over the years, you know, wanted to also participate as a software engineer. That was his expertise. So after a while, we navigated more towards consulting on the software side.
Mm-hmm.
And so we launched a company called Ingenium Corporation, which was relatively successful. We grew it to 300 employees, and we were in several states. And again, everything that I had learned to that point helped me in the entrepreneurial arena. And
I'm going to go back because I think it's still relevant for today, even though to your point, it was more challenging when you were pregnant in the workforce. Mm-hmm. Do you remember did you feel like I have to make a choice between being a mom or pursuing a career? And do you remember your emotions about it
Oh, it was
then?
so hard. The one thing I was afraid of was giving up my power. And I had already done some of that just by getting married. You compromise.
Mm-hmm.
I made a career decision in terms of not continuing with a company and going on to another company to sort of, be present.
Mm-hmm.
And
To
then,
make your marriage work.
to make the marriage work. And it was a compromise.
Sure.
People do it all the time.
Absolutely.
Right? They move with their spouse, whatever. And then with a child, in some ways, the workforce became a little bit toxic. I had people come up to me and say things like, "Oh, you're pregnant. That's corporate suicide." And I'm like, what?
Mm-hmm.
Is that the path? Me being very ignorant about the fact that somehow I couldn't make this work. But yeah, I did have to make some adjustments, and I was afraid that I would give away my power. So what I thought I was doing when I became a consultant, like independent, was I was seizing that power back.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to make it happen the way I want it to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, but then as the company Ingenium grew, I found that my ex-husband, people were viewing him as the power broker, so to speak, between us.
Mm-hmm.
And there were situations, little microaggressions, where people wouldn't even acknowledge me. They would just see him as the authority,
The driver
on thing.
of mm-hmm.
Exactly. And then as a result, he would get certain opportunities that may be more lucrative.
Mm-hmm.
So I would allow that. We were both benefiting, financially, but that also required me to adjust for children. We decided to have a second child.
Mm-hmm.
And I became primary everything.
Mm-hmm.
He began to travel extensively. And so I have to say I gave up a little bit of my power. And it came into play. It was magnified when divorce was the option.
Mm-hmm.
And the divorce really was about a power struggle.
Right.
It was. And while some people are comfortable with giving up power, I was so not that person,
Mm-hmm.
and I felt like I had made enough concessions,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of all the things that we wanted to do as a family and as business partners. And it became a point of contention. So what I realized is that our drive was a little bit different, our goals. While we were drawn together because we were both aspirational, when it came down to it, his value system around success was status and I guess notoriety in some ways. And mine was more building legacy.
Mm-hmm.
I really, really was working for the joy of working and having my own, destiny in my hand and being able to pass on a legacy. And that's a major conflict, especially when you're building something.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a long time though. 20 years we worked together in the business and 23 years we were married. But during that time I did step out and it was fun. I became class mom, all those things and commuting my kids to school. But for me, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough.
Well, and I think that's a real conversation that's even significant today is that it's okay for women to feel like your life doesn't have to be your children, right? They're a significant part of it, but it's okay to get and need, I don't know what the word is, value is the wrong word, but happiness.
As individuals.
Yes, as individuals.
It's healthy for all of us,
Yeah.
for men, for women.
Parent is one part.
Yes. Well, and in my case, and I'm sure other women can relate to this, sometimes you end up carrying most of the weight.
Mm-hmm.
And I did feel a certain, I was drawn to make sure the kids were all right, especially that someone was present, especially with my ex-husband being traveling so much. And so I felt the need to step away for a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as the kids became mature, I ended up coming back into the business. And at that point, the power shift had occurred and it became a bit contentious. And I didn't want that for the business, of course, because the whole idea was to build a legacy, not destroy it,
Mm-hmm.
So that but the divorce was a distraction because we were business partners. And so that took a while. It was 3 years divorcing, about 3 years to separate from the business, and ended up having to dissolve it. And I have to say, I didn't win.
Right.
I had to walk away with my dignity more than anything, but I still had my skill sets and the idea that there were no limits. And after all that, I went and did it again.
What is the one piece? I want to move on from this to the next chapter, if you will. But my last question on this topic: what's a piece of advice that you have for people that are getting in business with family in general?
That's the most complicated business deal, and you need to have an agreement. Absolutely. And we were young and in love and ambitious, and had these vows. But you'll find that the people that you love the most, when they're challenged in these situations, they feel most comfortable abandoning the verbal or sort of contract that you had, because you're family or because you're their loved one. And that's why you find families fighting. Even you can see some wealthy families where they end up fighting over things when they really should be focusing on their legacy, right? Instead of trying to tear it away. So it's have a shareholders agreement, something as simple as that. And again, the business evolved and we believed certain things about each other, but not having that shareholder agreement resulted in a long, drawn out fight to recreate what the agreement was. And if you can even think about marriage, it's also a contract. But it's so easy to get into. You don't sign anything but the marriage license, right? But when you divorce, everyone takes stock of what that relationship was and what actually happened. So I would also say get a prenup. No, I think it really makes sense because today, let's face it, many marriages end in divorce. And when things go wrong, that's when your value system is challenged. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
And the value system for any relationship, business relationship and personal, but business, we'll stick with the business for now. Business relationship, I think, is the importance of it is huge, right?
It's different. It's a different relationship, but if you already have a contract with someone, whether it's your sister, you have a certain way of dealing with each other. All of these things, you really need to decide the rules of engagement. How are you going to conduct yourself when certain situations surface? Even in the sale, like in the sale of a business, everyone wants to benefit, but you have different ideas of what that means. So I recommend, I consult to startups and, friends that come together and they haven't thought about how their role and their contribution. So it's good to describe your, to define your role, your contribution. What are you bringing? I'm bringing business development. I'm bringing the technology. And how do you value those things when it all comes down to it? Because when you sell or when even investors come in, you have to decide, where do I fit in now? Because the situation changes completely when another authority, another power comes in. So yeah, it's and it's so simple. It's not difficult at all to have an agreement.
Right.
Yeah. It's the thing you start with. So I do that now.
Lesson learned.
Yes.
So let's go from there. So that business ends up dissolving, and then take us to the next chapter. Well, not
exactly. It's all overlapping.
Okay.
Because that took 6 years, like the divorce and the business. So I'm still like trying to do my thing. So after I exited Ingenium, I was still a shareholder, for a while until we finished the deal. But I ended up consulting again to small businesses, to not-for-profits, joining a couple of boards and companies that I was, active with. But it was a blow, I have to say, because with that, I had built this network socially, professionally, that was no longer available to me in a lot of ways. And because of the power and also the conflict, whether it is my attorneys, my accountants, my colleagues in the business, the board members that were at first advocates for me, but now sort of joining forces with my ex, I was a little bit lost, as to how to rebuild. The consulting, gigs kind of came easy, but it wasn't necessarily a focus that I wanted. I know that at some point I wanted to launch another business. And, but while navigating this sort of rupture or disruption, I started experiencing things, that made me pause. So I'm no longer coupled. My kids are off to college. And so I don't have that school proximity, with those types of parents. I lose a lot of business contacts. And then I up and moved to a new city because I don't know why, but
but you came to
Baltimore. That's right. I came to Baltimore. And while I was in Maryland, Baltimore was sort of an afterthought. I, spent most of my time in the DC area professionally. So I'm pretty much starting from scratch. And I end up buying a house in Baltimore, like after everyone's telling me not to come here. It was right after, the uprising around Freddie Gray. And there's a lot of tension in the city. And, they still have these issues with violence. And I end up coming into the city to buy a house. But I had in mind that, I do want to be somewhere where I can make a difference. And I also want to start over again. Baltimore I could get my hands around it. It was less expensive than DC, post-divorce. And again, not necessarily ending up where I wanted to be financially with the exit on the business. So I'm just sort of falling into line with what I've been dealt. How am I going to get through this? So I'm loving my house. I'm sitting there one evening and I wanted to go see this opera at the Kennedy Center. And I know this is really, I'm pretty comfortable on my own, but I still realized that my social structure, like the things that the people I relied on were not necessarily there for me. My friends were coupled still. They still did things around their relationship status. And so I want to go to this opera at the Kennedy Center. It's a very unique opera. It's 15 hours long. I couldn't convince anyone to go with me. And it was an opera that, it's called The Ring Cycle. Very, comes around once a decade. So it was rare. It was going to be in production over 3 weeks, 4 productions. I'd have to commute to the Kennedy Center. Now I'm in Baltimore, So I made all these excuses not to go. But honestly, I really wanted to share it with someone. And so I opted out. And serendipitously, I'm at a party at a restaurant opening in Baltimore, and I meet a banker who happens to be an opera singer on the side. And he told me he was in the production. And I thought, oh my gosh, well, I opted out of that. And I feel so bad. He said, well, first he scolded me. And he's like, there were 4 people who had come on their own, who had come to each installment. And by the end, they had bonded with each other and they had bonded with the cast. And I thought, if I had gone, I would have found my tribe. And this really irked me. First, I was upset with myself for opting out because I'm pretty comfortable on my own, but I still loved the idea that I had a community to enjoy these things with. And I wanted to recreate that somehow. So I started canvassing people around me, as I'm starting to grow my network. Like, do you do this sort of thing? I also asked my family, do you opt out of things sometimes because you can't convince a +1? Almost universally.
Sure.
Except people who were kind of prickly who said, well, I don't care. I'll just go. I'm like, that's fine. But sometimes there are things that are just, they lend themselves to a shared experience, right? And I wanted to be able to build my community. And I was a little disillusioned with the dating apps. I mean, just getting in there after so many years, and also Meetup, even like I was getting hit on Meetup. And I'm like, what is this? So I decide that I'm going to launch this idea where when you don't want to go out alone and you prefer community, you prefer a +1 or plus some, as we like to call it, how would you like to go out with this new social network? So I launched on Valentine's Day, 2017, this idea. And that I said, we're having a virtual Valentine's Day party, no +1 required. Come join this new social network where when you go out, you don't have that awkward feeling when you arrive. You can meet your +some. So people started signing up for this idea. I didn't know how I was going to fulfill this promise. So I went out and started, figuring out how could I get events, and venues, hospitality and entertainment venues to accommodate groups of solos. So I experimented with a couple of, it was hard though. I have to tell you, it was hard. And this is a recurring theme. It was hard to get venues to recognize that there's a solo patron that they may be overlooking or sidelining to the bar that they could benefit from and fill their seats. Now, the catch was they had to create a shared experience. It wasn't just a customer in, customer out, which is what they're used to. So I finally convinced a theater and a brewery/restaurant to hold these inaugural events. And they were free events, but I had waiting lists. People came and I thought, this is amazing. And I started meeting this population that maybe even I overlooked as a coupled person. There were all these people navigating solo who wanted this, whether they were new to a city or, had, made a life shift like me and were trying to sort of strengthen their social circle. So people came and, that's how I started a Mixolo. And I don't want to go on and on about it. You can certainly ask me about how we've evolved. But yeah. So eventually Mixolo, the going out app, emerged. It took about 1.5 years to get there, but that became my new venture. And just because of what I was experiencing, you know what they say, necessity is the mother of convenience, right? And also I loved the idea of being able to meet people that were not in a bubble, because I did find that the couple bubble is a bubble,
Right.
And there's an age bubble where you don't venture out and you don't necessarily communicate with other people in different generations. There were all these bubbles and I didn't fit in any of them. So Mixolo is just more welcoming. It's people meeting on common ground first. And also, we're helping venues, hospitality and entertainment venues fill their seats.
How does Mixolo transcend age, race, gender, whatever, versus other apps that might be out there?
By mistake. When I started out, I didn't know who my audience would be. Even when I put it out on Facebook, it was, looking at the analytics, it was everyone. It was even married people who, whether it was a military wife who, was still looking for community and landing in a city where, she was there on her own. Because initially we interacted more women, but later, like their spouses would come, but the idea is we made it it's platonic, organic engagement. We stress that. We also make it's a blind gathering. Like you don't know who you're going out with. So I think, like I said, I sort of set that up by mistake, but I was trying to figure out what my market was, like who would want this thing. So it ended up that whether it's a Shakespeare production or a brew walk, there could be a millennial and a retiree at that event from all different backgrounds. And that's just how we roll. And it was really interesting. They're connecting on their common ground first. And it makes for an environment that allows them to grow their community around that interest. Because let's say you're 70 and you love Rihanna. Now
who doesn't?
70-year-old friends wants to go to a Rihanna concert and deal with the noise, right? But you still want to go. So you go with those young people who want to enjoy that concert. And I have to say, we haven't reached Rihanna yet. But BSO, we go to the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra.
There you go.
We have some cool music groups that do events for us. But yeah, so now looking back on this journey, maybe I should have focused on a specific audience or a specific type of event. But building something new, you have to take what comes. And as a result, we have a variety of events. We had our first trip this past fall. And we just have a variety of people. And I have to say, there's a persona emerging, and I think might be because of economics, but we have late millennials, early Generation Xers who many of them have never married. This is another trend. that I now, I follow these trends now as a solo. They're like amazing career people, from geneticists to ex-engineers, whatever. But they've focused on their careers. They've been somewhat geographically fluid.
Mm-hmm.
So they're moving about, but they don't have that solid circle, but they also love going out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a persona that's emerging, that's coming back again and again. But no, it's everyone. And now our analytics, which are somewhat limited with the platform that I have to say it's a prototype. They're somewhat limited, but no, the largest cohort, if I look at the cohorts, is millennials, then Generation X. But now we're starting to get signups from Generation Z because we're 18 and up. And there was a study done the other day that is one of the loneliest generations. And much of that is because they were raised with technology. So they're not getting that in real life connection. And they want it. And they're craving experiences. So I feel like we're on the cusp of something.
Yeah.
If you can think of us, we're kind of like an Airbnb where we match a ready host who's solo friendly with solo guests that are ready to go out. So we created this events marketplace of solo friendly events where people can search and discover events, but they know when they arrive, they'll have other solos who are on their own to connect with. People want to go out, but they also want to feel that they're part of something. So that's what we provide. And we're trying to get our hosts to think that way. And right now they're more customer in, customer out. They like the banquet model where there's a down payment and a reliable group. But so now we're telling them, hey, you're missing out. There's a solo consumer rising. And product companies recognize it. The Fortune 50 companies are focusing on creating products because 30% of households are one person in the household. So there's a consumer out there that's, unfortunately, some of them are being isolated through technology or just, again, the fact that we're so geographically fluid right now, where we're moving about and we don't have those same social structures that help us build community.
What do you say to people, or advice that you have for people? Like, starting a new business is not necessarily early in career game, right? Like you started a business.
I had some experience. Yeah. And
people that want to jump.
I have to say, it's not for everyone. I have to tell you that it doesn't make sense that I would have a startup at this stage in my life.
Yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's but that's the way that's probably my personality in a little bit ways. Like I am a problem solver. I also, again, like I sometimes have blindfold on when it comes to limits. So that could be meaning I'm delusional in some ways, but no, I'm going to say it. Maybe it's not for everyone, but I did have a good solid 10 years of work experience before I really, put everything out there. And my ex-husband and I were relatively young. At that point, we had one child and we had a house, and we just decided, what's our threshold? What are we willing to lose? And we pretty much said everything, not, certainly we want to take care of our child, but we would even say that we'd mortgage the house. That would be like once we did that, it didn't work out, we'd step back. But we felt confident enough that we had some work experience that we could go back to work if it didn't work out. So we had a plan. And, you don't have to start off diving right in. It was a gradual. I was consulting, and then we decided to launch the company officially. My ex-husband stayed at work for a little while and did it part-time.
Well, and to fast forward, even Mixolo starting that when you did.
Yeah. Well,
right?
actually, I went all in. I did go all in. I was full-time with it for a couple of years, but I then fell back on that accounting degree.
There you go. Keep sneaking up, coming in handy.
That's right. And I decided, and I'm actually doing that part-time. And that's really to keep Mixolo going. So if you have to keep that day job, do it. Start it. You can start anywhere with that dream. Or if you're feeling confident and you have a team around you, and maybe a, financial support, just do it. Because if it's something that you're experiencing, other people are too.
Well, and that's what I think is really so special about you and the situation that you're doing with Mixolo is, and it applies to things that you've mentioned throughout your life, right? But the no limits piece of it,
Exactly.
I have an aspiration, I have a dream, I'm going to go for that, and I'm going to learn, I'm going to fail, I'm going to do whatever, and the age or years of experience or what's around me isn't going to stop me from striving.
Right. That's right. I mean, why not? And everything you've been doing to date, all of anyone listening, is preparing you. Everything. It all matters.
I love that.
I always say, doing a menial task right now, do it well. Somebody's going to recognize it and you're going to learn from it as well. You're certainly going to learn what you want. You don't want that, maybe. I don't know. But, it's okay to like have something stable and still take a risk. And or jump out and do it. It depends on your situation, and certainly set your threshold for what your level of risk is.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, I had a certain amount of money that I was willing to invest of my own in Mixolo. But at that end of that 2-year period, I was not able to reach those revenue levels. And I realized that I was onto more than a business. It was a movement. Like there were barriers, psychological barriers, societal barriers to this idea of identifying this way and for people accepting you as that,
Well, yeah. And I think it's also really important to note and for the audience listening that using your words, right? You went all in. It was starting not to generate the revenue that you necessarily needed, but your risk tolerance was still, I want to continue this, but there's a practical side to that too, that you have bills to pay, right?
That's right.
So you have a solution for that while continuing to pursue what you want to do, which I think is definitely noteworthy and definitely something that people will get value from.
Absolutely.
Because
and even that, when I made that decision to major in accounting when I didn't think I wanted to, oh my God, that was one of the best decisions I ever made.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me the freedom to do all of these things. So there are really no mistakes unless you view them as mistakes. There are disappointments. I'm not going to say there aren't disappointments. This is really hard. I'm not going to lie. One of my favorite books is The Hard Thing About Hard Things. I recommend that to everyone. And this is Ben Horowitz is, I hope I have his name right, is the author. He's one of the...
Andreessen Horowitz.
Yes, Andreessen Horowitz. Exactly.
Venture capitalist in California.
But, I mean, they made their money working really hard. Now, I have to say their situation was a little bit different than mine. They had a team. They were in Silicon Valley. People were throwing money at them. But it was still hard for them. There were so many failures. But they ended up, while they didn't... they ended up selling what they were developing. But he ended up being like the forefather of the cloud, with all that work that was put in. And while the business itself didn't take off, he changed the world. Mm-hmm. And then he went on to invest in other really meaningful companies. So, so I'm saying everything, even the failures matter. If you can look at it that way.
I love the theme that you mentioned, that you don't have to have, it's not necessarily a straight direct path in anything, that you can learn things in your career that you can apply to different industries, different jobs. The principles that you learn and develop are still applicable regardless of the direction that you might go, which I think is really important.
Absolutely.
What is, 2 more questions for you, then I want to get to rapid fire. What is, if you could give any advice to your younger self, what would that be? And when I say that, somebody, I'm going to say early in the job market, or like looking for doing a career change of some sort.
Well,
so younger is probably not a fair way to ask it.
Yeah. Well, just making a shift, those shifts. Well, I mean, it's really a personal choice, but I really believe that you should always be pursuing that thing that you're passionate about, even if it doesn't look like a business idea. It's still going to take you to those places that you want to be. Whether it's some altruistic dream that you have of serving a certain community, start doing it. Next thing you know, you're the executive director of some nonprofit that's making changes in the world. So you do just a little bit here and there. It builds up. I mean, it's so simple. It's true. The other thing is the mindset is really important. I operate on first principles. I always, instead of saying, we've never done that before, or that won't work because this is the way we always do it. I never subscribe to that. And that's the only time I say never. I just don't subscribe to it. I look at the basic problem, the problem we're dealing with, and all the different possible solutions to solve it. So when someone comes up to me and says, well, why are you doing that? There's already meetup. I said, well, there's a different way to meet up, and I'm not satisfied with that. And so, it's really, you have to keep that sort of first principle mindset. And if people can look it up. I won't go into detail, but it's sort of thinking like a scientist where, maybe that was a failure or maybe that worked, but is that the only solution?
Sure.
Is penicillin the only solution? No. It turned out there were 100 other antibiotics that worked as well. And that was based on failure and circumstances. So I think if we can apply that in life, oh my God, we could do so much.
Failure is underrated.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One is, I lied. I said I had 2 more and I actually have now 2 more. So what advice do you have or perspective do you have for people that, and talking in the business standpoint or the corporate standpoint, that walk into a room, and you gave an example of walking into a boardroom earlier, right? And I don't want to put words in your mouth. It wasn't that you felt you didn't belong. That's not at all what you said, but I'm trying to think how you said it. Walking into a space where in a corporate standpoint, where maybe
they're not used to you being there.
Thank you. That's
absolutely.
Yes.
That's really what it is.
What advice do you have for people that feel that?
Right. Well, the one thing is, first of all, be yourself. I think that's so important. Authenticity is important. And I know people say, no, you should really take on the culture, but you're not going to stand out if you blend in. And while you certainly want to have a certain decorum and protocol, the way you're dealing with people, you want to be yourself. And, for many years, people have said, oh, the road to success is to mirror that other person. That's so not true. It's really to listen and connect with that person on some ground. I used to do some fun, team working exercises when I was consulting. And I just remember doing it was an environment that I went in where culturally, it was changing. Like young people were coming into an organization where it was pretty mature. It was an engineering company. And I had them, they had to figure out one thing they had in common, and they had a certain amount of time to do it. And there was an older gentleman and a younger woman, really young. And they ended up coming up with the commonality they had was they both loved Barry White. And they were so vastly different people. I mean, and it was so funny. And they still connect to this day over that commonality in the office. What?
Wow.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that transcends to Mixolo. Just not to go back on it.
But I'm just saying, it's the way that I've navigated the world. And when I say it's worked for me. I mean, there were times where people aren't receptive, and those are people you just can't reach, but you can demonstrate for them. You can certainly demonstrate and be consistent. So I would say, isn't that crazy? Be yourself and certainly find a way to connect with that person, because everyone wants to feel valued and everyone should leave the room with their dignity.
I love that. How do you, my last question before we get to rapid fire, how do you define success?
Oh, yeah. I think I've been thinking about this in contentment. It really is like you're satisfied with your circumstance. And I alluded to that sort of disruption in the value system when I was married and in business. I really never wanted to be famous. Do you know what I mean? It was more like I wanted to feel that my job was well done. I kind of want to, I guess Steve Jobs may not be the one. I heard he was a terrible boss, but I want to go out like that. Not that I created something amazing, but that when people think of me, they've seen that I made a difference in their lives. And I feel like that's what we're all here for. And anytime I help someone else, I'm helping myself, right? So yeah, I think a level of contentment. And if you don't have that, that means you're not pursuing those things that bring you that. And to operate based on someone else's expectations is only going to limit you and result in unhappiness. So content, when you can feel that this is good, no matter what else is going on around you, then you're living a good life.
I love that.
Thanks.
What else before I get to rapid fire? Any other topics that you want to talk about that we didn't cover?
Well, I want to thank you. This is my first long form interview.
You're rocking it.
I love sharing with people, and I just, if you want to learn more about my journey, or if you even want to get in touch, please just contact me through the website. I love talking to startups. I mean, I kind of feed off them, right? Because they get what I'm doing. Or people who are thinking about it. In fact, so many people approach me with their ideas. It's funny. But I ask them what they're doing. So what are you doing to get there?
You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So check out if they want to follow up or get in touch with you.
Yes,
go to the website.
Mixolo.io. They can contact me there, and certainly follow what Mixolo's doing. We're ready to change the world. So wherever you're navigating solo in the world, you can find your plus some.
Perfect. And I will put a link to the site in the write-up for the podcast.
Thank you.
All right. So I'm going to jump to rapid fire, totally unrelated to what we've talked about so far. So just either or. Could you see? You're cheating? No.
I can't. I have my glasses on.
I'm kidding. Moon or sun?
Sun.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Brick or stone?
Stone.
Mountains or beach?
Mountains.
Netflix or cable?
Netflix.
Netflix or Hulu?
Netflix.
Netflix or Amazon Prime?
Netflix all the way.
We have a gold medal winner with Netflix.
Although I have all of them.
Summer or winter?
Oh gosh, that's tough. I love fall. Oh my gosh. But I love winter because I love to ski. I love the mountains. So
okay. Winter.
Winter.
All right. And the last one, cats or dogs?
Dogs.
All right.
But considering cat.
This is the Lauren Asghari podcast, How'd Her Career Get There? And again, my guest was Carolyn Walton Lynch, the founder of Mixolo. Thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you, Lauren. I appreciate you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. And to the audience out there, we will see you next time.
Let's talk a bunch of different topics.
How'd her career get there?
This is a podcast with Lauren Asghari.